Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Well, it's a very great privilege to welcome Professor Peter Clarke here to this Faraday course on the final day, on a very sunny day in Cambridge. Peter Clarke is the Professor of Neuroscience at the Department of Cell Biology and Morphology in the University of Lausanne. Has spent many years working there, especially on the area of programmed cell death, that is apoptosis in neurons. And he's going to give us now the second of two talks this morning, and this one's entitled Genetics, Brain Plasticity and Personhood. Thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you, Dennis. And I should say thank you to Rodney for inviting me to talk on this subject, which I wouldn't have chosen otherwise, because it involves some very interesting questions where I'm not at all sure of the answers. But at least I'll do my best at least to raise the questions, and maybe you'll help me with the answers. So the first talk was focused on rather abstract questions, the soul, physical determinism. This second talk is closer to questions of day-to-day living, such as personhood. By that I mean our motivation, our moral sense, and our spirituality, and the problem that these are anchored in the physical, fallible brain. A few years ago, a school teacher who was a responsible, normal kind of school teacher, suddenly started getting interested in sex magazines, got involved in child pornography, or at least was interested in child pornography, started to go to prostitutes, and stated that the pleasure principle overrode his urge to restraint. He was against his own behavior, he thought it was wrong, but he said his pleasure principle was too strong. And when he started making sexual advantages to his daughter, his stepdaughter, who was pre-adolescent, his wife called the police, and fortunately for him, I mean, he was actually found guilty, and then a tumor was discovered and removed. And the aberrant behavior faded away. There incidentally is the tumor, an enormous tumor. It's amazing the size of tumors in the brain. To get changes, you usually have enormous tumors. And I always find it amazing that you have such big tumors to have these moderately subtle effects. A year later, the tumor started growing back, the urges returned, the new tumor was removed, and the urges subsided again. This was well documented. So I think this raises questions about our responsibility. I mean, if I had that tumor, I suppose I would get involved in sex magazines and child pornography and prostitutes. Perhaps, who knows? It certainly raises questions. So are we responsible for our moral failings, or just the victims of our inadequate brains? Are we genetically programmed to be immoral? When I told my wife that I was going to talk about moral failings, she said, well, that's good, I think you'll give a good talk about it. It's a subject you know well. And then there's a related question I'm going to discuss, the validity of religious experience, and whether this is due to brain dysfunction, as some people have claimed, and a related question again, are we genetically programmed to believe? So in each case, both the responsibility for moral failings and the religious experience, there's a question of inadequate brains related to the question of reductionism, and there's a question of determinism, including the question of genetic determinism, but other kinds as well. I'd like to tell you a bit about pleasure centers in the brain, because we've been talking about the pleasure principle that overrode. And I talked in my first talk about Hess in Zurich, who implanted electrodes in the hippocampus and stimulated and produced in cats the desire to sleep, to have sex, to eat, to drink, and so on. Now, James Olds did a very good experiment. I don't know if he didn't have enough money to pay a graduate student to do the experiment, and so he asked the rat to do the experiment. In other words, he had electrodes transplanted, placed in the brains of rats. This is a human brain, but he places electrodes in the brains of rats. But instead of stimulating himself or paying someone else to stimulate the rat, he gave the rat the opportunity to push the button. He put the button in the cage. And if the electrode was in certain places, the rat was very enthusiastic to push the button. They would actually cross electrified grids to push the button. They would press the button hundreds of times and neglect to eat or to drink. Pushing the button was more important. And there were several, and he called these centers in the brain where you place the electrode, pleasure centers. Now, I'm going to talk about just one of these, the nucleus accumbens, which in the human brain is in this place, in the basal part of the forebrain. And as you see, this nucleus accumbens gets connections from an area that's called VTA here. VTA means the ventral tegmental area. It's a region of the brain that uses dopamine as a transmitter. So this molecule that communicates between neurons, and the molecule that's released at the synapse and binds to receptors, in this case, is dopamine, and the ventral tegmental area projects to the nucleus accumbens, as is shown there. And if he put the electrode in the nucleus accumbens, he had this behavior, apparently pleasure-seeking behavior of pushing the button. And if instead of having an electrode, he had a pipette which contained dopamine or cocaine, cocaine enhances the action of dopamine, because dopamine is taken back into synapses when it's released, and cocaine blocks the reuptake mechanism. So it means that the dopamine stays there in the synaptic cleft for longer. So it enhances the action of dopamine. So if the electrode released dopamine or cocaine, again, the rat was keen to push the button to get dopamine or cocaine in that area. Now, he didn't do that. Other people did that. And actually the same result if you stimulated the ventral tegmental area, which of course led to the release of the dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. Now, we do know that in drug addicts, the desire to take cocaine is related to the activation of the nucleus accumbens, and we do know also that the addiction of drug addicts is due to changes where the nucleus accumbens becomes less responsive to the dopamine. You need more dopamine because the neurons have adapted to become less stimulated. So we know quite a bit about the nucleus accumbens, and this is just to explain what I did say briefly. The dopamine is released in the synapse, so this is the synaptic terminal, sometimes called the synaptic bouton, and the dopamine is released, and it binds to receptors that cause quite complicated effects in the next cell, and normally the dopamine is released, it is taken back by the dopamine transporter to be reused, and cocaine blocks the dopamine transporter. Now, and this is what I explained about the drug addiction, that the excessive dopamine stimulation of the nucleus accumbens weakens the synapses, and therefore you've got to have more stimulation. And so, if, for example, you're a bit depressed and needing stimulation, needing satisfaction in life, and so you start to take cocaine, you need more and more of it. Actually, it's the same thing with gambling. It's been shown that gambling causes release of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens, and you get the same phenomenon, that you get a downregulation, a weakening of the effects of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens, and so you need more gambling to get the stimulation, and so you get addiction to gambling, just as you can get addiction to cocaine. It's not only drugs, it's also the behavioral phenomena. Now, this has been studied in people, and I have to say that the results in people have not been as clear as the results in animals, but nevertheless one has observed the same phenomenon, and this is a very controversial American surgeon. Actually, neurosurgeons tend to be very courageous people. They do things that other people would not dare to do, and I suppose you need to have that mentality to take such responsibility. But he was convinced that he could cure people, actually, of homosexuality by giving them the possibility to stimulate their brains. And so he did sort of experiments on humans. And this one had the name of B-19, which sounds a bit like an American bomber. But this person was given the button, and I don't know where the electrode was, actually, because there are several pleasure centers. But he self-stimulated 1,500 times in 3 hours, so he's really pushing the button madly. And then when they told him, now the experiment's finished, please give us the button, he said no, and carried on pushing the button. And so he had to be disconnected despite protest. But actually when he was asked, and when other people had been asked, they didn't say that was glorious happiness. They said, no, I just wanted to push the button. And they found it hard to explain what this pleasure was. So pleasure is somehow in inverted commas, but it seems to be at least the desire to do something, even though it's hard to really put into words what the pleasure was like. Now, that's one point, that looking at the question of pleasure. But now I'd like to come to the question of psychopathy, I think it's roughly the same thing as sociopathy, and brain damage apparently can cause it. People have studied the brains of people, of psychopaths. You know psychopaths, people who are just not concerned about their behavior. They can do brutal things and not really care. And so they're very dangerous people. They may commit murders and so on, and they seem to have no moral qualms about committing murders in extreme cases. And so it's quite complicated to do, because of course different brains are different anyway. But by comparing a large number of brains, moderate number of brains, you can find differences between the brains of psychopaths and other people. And the regions that were different were mainly, but not only, in the frontal lobes. Here, it doesn't really matter the details. The frontal polar cortex, the orbitofrontal cortex, some regions in the temporal lobe as well, and the insula, which is the deep region underneath the temporal lobe, which is that part of the brain, at the side. So there were reductions in grey matter, in the active part of the brain, in psychopaths compared to the brains of healthy volunteers. This was based on brain scans, so this was not dead people. This was, you can scan the brain while the person is still alive. In this case, they weren't measuring brain activity, they were just measuring the quantity of grey matter. Now, and so it does seem that the frontal lobe, especially the prefrontal lobe, in the frontal lobe there's a part that's involved in motor control, and then a part in front of that that's involved in many things, including planning, but also involved in self-control. So that's the prefrontal lobe. And one thing that's been shown is that there's reduced glucose metabolism in the prefrontal lobe in murderers compared with normal controls. There have been several studies. It's been shown that acts of aggressive and impulsive behavior are associated with a reduced metabolism in certain parts of the prefrontal lobe. It's been shown that individuals with orbitofrontal lesions are typically disinhibited, impulsive, and unconcerned with the consequences of their behavior. And that's what I mentioned about colleagues at work who are described as frontal. And so the sort of thing one can wonder, and this is probably much too simple, but nevertheless maybe at least partly right, the sort of thing we can imagine is that there are brain systems involved in moral responsibility, self-control, that are inhibiting other brain systems for our basic needs and desires. We want sex, we want food, we go and kill someone, we go and rape someone, and so on. And then we've got other brain regions that inhibit these basic desires. And then these may be integrated in some center that sends commands to the motor system. And then if this region is missing or underdeveloped or something, then you've got a problem, right? You're not going to control your behavior very well. Is there a sort of struggle between different brain systems? And of course, we routinely speak of it in a conflict. And in the epistle of James, he writes, "What causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you?" I think that means a battle within an individual person. And Paul writes, "Those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires." The flesh meaning the basic self with its passions and desires. It doesn't eliminate eliminate them, it may to some extent change them, but to some extent there's a sort of inner crucifixion, there's a battle within. And could it be that these brain systems for moral responsibility are essential to this? So what happens if those regions are underdeveloped? Was a school teacher with a frontal lobe tumour responsible for his lack of restraint? I think he's got a good excuse. He's got a physical problem in the brain, and I don't think anyone in that case would say he was entirely responsible for his behaviour. But what about a drug addict who gives way to his urge to take more drugs? Is he responsible? I mean, he's got an excuse. He's got a physical problem in the nucleus accumbens, these synapses that have been changed. He's not getting the stimulation in the nucleus accumbens that we're all getting. We're getting satisfaction. I'm getting satisfaction from giving this talk. I hope you're getting satisfaction from listening and so on. And he's not getting it. He's different. And so he's got an excuse. It's a physical problem in his brain. Are we responsible when we give way to our urges to do what's wrong? Have we got an excuse? Maybe our brains too are physical, certainly. And is our restraint system, this restraint system I showed, is that too weak? And as I said, Paul wrote, for I don't do the good I want to do, but instead do the evil that I don't want to do. Even Paul had this problem that we basically don't have a restraint system that's sufficiently strong. And so morality may be more difficult for some people than others. It can be a battle for us all, but it can be maybe more difficult for some people than others. What does this tell us about responsibility? And in the judicial system, should we take account of this? Now there's been some work on the genetics of criminality. I mean, up to now I've talked about the brain, but there's a related question of genetics, because of course the brain develops at least partly under genetic control. So the question is, are criminals criminal because of genetics? There was actually a professor in the hospital where I partly work, at least in the same medical faculty as me, who arranged to made a few fake companies in Paris and stole 5 million Swiss francs, and that was, of course, not considered a good thing. But his father was also a criminal, also a famous criminal. Incidentally, stole a painting from the Louvre, the main art gallery in Paris. Was it genetic? Not really responsible, it's genetic. Now, on the genetics of criminality, basically the evidence is not very good, but there is some evidence for a genetic basis of criminality in genes controlling the monoamine neurotransmitters. So that's the group of neurotransmitters that includes dopamine that I've already talked about, and noradrenaline, that's a neurotransmitter a bit like the hormone adrenaline, and serotonin, a third one. Serotonin is the transmitter that we control when we take Prozac, you know, the antidepressant Prozac. That, I'm not going to go into the details, but that controls the effects of serotonin. So these are regulators of mood and emotions and desires, and it's really not surprising that changes in the genes that control this system affect our moods and emotions and desires, and ultimately our behavior. So here's some interesting studies on the genetic contribution to violence. Now, one thing is clear, that the tendency of one person to be violent and not another, it does not only depend on genes, it also depends on the way one was reared. Was one abused in childhood? And actually one of the most interesting studies looks at the interaction between these two things together. The way one was reared and genes. So this was a study on the role of genotype in the cycle of violence in maltreated children. Genotype just means that some details of the genes. And now they studied a polymorphism at the promoter of the gene for monoamine oxidase. I'm not going to go into the details of this, that the promoter is the part of the gene that controls, it's actually not a part of the gene, but it's related to a gene, and it controls how much the gene will be made into RNA to ultimately make protein. So it ultimately controls the effect of a gene. And a polymorphism, it can exist in different forms. And they compared one form that causes there to be low activity of this enzyme, which controls the monoamines in the brain, and another allele, another polymorphism that controls that leads to higher activity of the enzyme. And what they discovered was that, and then now we got these 3 columns for people who were not maltreated, or probably minor maltreatment, or severely maltreated. And if you looked at the class which has the high activity of the enzyme, which actually leads to lower amounts of the monoamines, there's not much difference between the 3 groups. So even if you're maltreated, well, it doesn't help, but it doesn't greatly increase the probability of contact disorder in this case. But if you've got the low activity of the enzyme, which means you've got more of the monoamines, then if you're maltreated, suddenly this causes a great increase in conduct disorder, which is a mild thing. And here we look at violent offences, again the same sort of thing in the ones with the low MAOA group, and violent disposition and antisocial personality disorders. So different criteria, but this one deals with actual convictions. These others deal with just results in psychological tests. But in each case, the message is the same. That being maltreated alone has a slight effect, but not very great. But if, in addition to that, there's a genetic change, then the maltreatment will have a big effect. So the conclusion on this, at least for those carrying the low MAO gene, is what I've just said, that it's correlated with antisocial and violent behavior in people mistreated in childhood, but no such effect, or only a very slight effect. And actually in some cases it could be, carrying this gene could even be beneficial in other people. So it's when the 2 come together that you've got a problem. So are these people responsible? I've talked about the effects of the environment, being reared, maltreated in childhood. That's one example of the effects of the environment. By the environment, we mean that all the external influences on someone. This can be what they eat, what they drink, what they see, anything. So we know lots of things about this. For example, rats brought up in a complex environment have bigger brains. Or it would be more true to say that rats brought up in the standard laboratory cage, which is a very impoverished environment have smaller brains. Sorry, I went too far. And I'd like to talk about some work on the visual system, where this has been studied in detail. Now, actually, the visual system is not terribly relevant to these ethical questions, but it just so happens that the visual system has been very well studied, and this is based to a great extent on the work of David Hubel and Torsten Wiesel. And they're looking very happy for 2 reasons. One is pharmacological, and the other is, one could say, existential, because they've just heard that they got the Nobel Prize, and they've also drunk, I happen to have heard, a very large amount of champagne. So they're very happy. And they studied the visual system, so we got the eye here, which of course contains the retina, which receives the visual image, which projects to the brain. Half the fibers cross to the other side, half stay on the same side in this optic chiasm. And then they go to a region deep in the brain called the lateral geniculate body, and then that projects to the visual cortex at the back. And so what, because this is a vast subject, I'm going to simplify. But they studied the projections from the lateral geniculate nucleus to the visual cortex, and they studied the effect of closing one eye for several weeks. So these poor little kittens, they've got one eye sewn closed. I mean, they're not actually suffering pain, but they've got one eye closed. And what we do know from humans, for example, humans with a cataract, that if when one's very young, one has a cataract. Then one becomes blind or almost blind in the eye that had the cataract. So that even if you take out the cataract, you do a good operation and everything should be fine optically, still you're blind in that eye. The reason is that there are changes in the connections in the visual cortex, especially the connections from the lateral geniculate nucleus to the visual cortex. And there are cells in the lateral geniculate nucleus that are activated by one eye or the other eye. And in the normal animal, they connect to slightly separate parts of the visual cortex. So there's a region that's dominated by the right eye, although it gets some input from the left eye, and there's other regions that are dominated by the left eye mainly, but not entirely. And in the animals in which the right eye was deprived for several weeks, so no pattern visual for several weeks, the left eye axons, they grow, they produce bigger arterizations, and those of the right eye diminish. So there's a sort of competition between the two eyes in this case, and the active eye, I mean, the stimulated eye, dominates the visual cortex because of changes in the brain. And this reminds us actually of Jesus, who healed a blind man, and after the initial healing he said, well, I can see men, but they're like trees. And I wonder if it's because of the deprivation. He was blind from birth. It was slightly different from his situation because he was blind in both eyes, but we know also people deprived in both eyes have abnormal connections. So he couldn't see properly because the connections in his visual cortex was wrong. And then Jesus did a second healing, and he saw normally. And so I can imagine that there was one healing for the eye and another healing for the brain. Of course, we don't know that, but it's a quite common interpretation. Now, so we got the experience has an influence, and we got the genes have an influence. But how do the two interact? One thing we do understand is that long-term effects on the brain have got to involve the genes, and the fact is that there are lots of ways in which the experience can affect the expression of the genes. So, as we've heard in other talks, you get the genes, the coding part of the DNA, of course all this is simplified, and then the so-called junk DNA, which may not be totally junk, but it's called junk DNA at the side of the gene. But the coding part of the DNA is transcribed, and that makes RNA, and then the RNA is translated, and that makes protein. Now, the genes encode the sequence of amino acids in the protein, or they encode the sequence in the RNA, which encodes the sequence in the protein. So indirectly, the DNA encodes the protein. And this sequence determines the form and hence the function of the protein. And there are also actually some proteins that control the transcription of the genes. So let's put an arrow going back. These are transcription factors. So some proteins have the job of controlling the transcription. They don't control the sequence. The sequence is fixed. Every cell in my body, except the red blood cells which have no genes, but all other cells in my body have the same genes. But what is different in the different cells in my bodies is that the amount of expression of the genes, in other words, how much is transcribed to make RNA and translated to make protein, the quantitative aspect changes even though the sequence does not change. So how does experience affect brain development? Well, experience causes electrical activity in the neurons, and so you get this release of neurotransmitter. But one of the things that changes when you get the transmitter binding to a receptor is that will cause calcium to go into the next cell. This is quite complicated. I'm simplifying. This can happen in several ways. But one way or another, it can cause calcium to go into the next cell. And the calcium ultimately affects so-called kinase cascades, and this has now shown that there are other important cascades, not only kinase cascades. I won't go into the details, but kinase cascades add phosphates on proteins, which changes their function. And this does all sorts of, the whole networks in the cell that control many things, including the control of transcription. So this is basically how it's done. The electrical experience doesn't change the gene sequences, but it can modify signaling proteins in the cell, and this can, among other things, change the transcription of the genes. So the genes don't control everything, and I'm actually an identical twin, and my brother would be very unhappy if people thought he was identical to me. And here are two identical twins who are also, they differ a bit. Twins are more similar than other people if you may measure their brain morphology, but nevertheless they're not identical. There are differences. There are differences in their intellectual abilities. When my brother and I applied to Oxford, we got identical marks in almost all the exams, and they actually thought we were the same person. And there was a danger of my brother not being accepted because they thought he was me. But nevertheless, we're not absolutely identical intellectually, even though we're similar. And there are differences in psychological characteristics. So they differ less than dizygotic twins, in other words, non-identical twins, but nevertheless, they do differ. The genes don't control everything. Now you can say, okay, the genes don't control everything because the environment also plays a role. But the two together control everything. And actually most psychological studies or behavioral studies on the causes of our behavior, they do assume that. They assume that you've got the genetic influence and you've got the environmental influence, and that's everything. But it's not absolutely everything. And this has been shown, for example, there's a fish called the Amazon molly, and for various reasons, you can have lots of these fish that are all genetically identical. You can have hundreds of them, all genetically identical. And you can have them all brought up in water of the same temperature, and as far as you can see, everything's identical. But if you look even at the most basic thing, in these animals, the optic nerve from the eyes to the brain crosses 100%, but sometimes it crosses left over right, and sometimes it crosses right over left. And it's actually roughly 50%, 50%. And this seems to be uncontrolled. It's not controlled by the environment, it's not controlled by the genes, it's just random. At least it's not controlled by anything we can study. And this is probably because when the first axons grow, and here's an axon with what's called the growth cone, which has little feelers coming out called philopodia, and they sort of poke out in different directions and try to find the way, rather like a rat with whiskers that's touching different things to try to find the way in the dark. And these philopodia try to find the way, and the axon grows, and one can imagine that the very first axons that get to the optic chiasm make an arbitrary choice. They go left over right or right over the left. And then the other axons follow the first ones. And so you get this perhaps unimportant, but nevertheless very visible difference. You don't even need a microscope to see it. But if you study in more detail, in these genetically identical, environmentally almost identical animals, there are differences in the connectivity between neurons, there are differences in the branching patterns of dendrites. There seem to be things that are not controlled entirely, even by the combination of genes and environment. And of course that's not surprising, because the genes don't control everything. If you take a cell, for example, there are things in the cytoplasm of the germ cell that will have some effect on the next cell, on the organism. For example, the mitochondria and so on. I needn't go into all the details. So, coming back to moral responsibility, and I admit it's a big jump, the responsibility of brain lesion patients may be seriously diminished in some cases. Environmental and genetic factors both contribute to behavior, but the determinism, even by the two together, is probably not total. Now, what are we going to deduce from that? And I said I'm going to raise more questions than answers. But Christianity emphasizes not just moral responsibility, but also the universality of sin. And Christianity emphasizes forgiveness, and Christianity emphasizes restoration. I'm sorry, I'm talking about Christianity because I don't presume to talk about Islam, but I guess that some of these things may be true of Islam. That would be for you to tell us. Now, I'd like to just give an example of a friend of mine she had an inherited problem. She was an inherited liability to depression. And because of that, she actually became a heroin addict. She told me that she took the heroin because she had this need, because she was feeling depressed and so on. But it became a real addiction for the physical reasons I explained. I talked about cocaine because it's simpler, but although it's more complicated, you get similar changes in the brain with heroin addiction. And then she didn't get AIDS, but she became positive for the AIDS virus. And so she had lots of problems. And then, actually, to pay for her heroin, she became a prostitute, worked more or less full-time as a prostitute to pay for the heroin. And although prostitution was not illegal, during those years as a prostitute, she did things that were illegal. I don't know the details. And there was a court case against her about 2 years after an offence. And she didn't actually say, look, it's not my fault because I got this inherited problem. And she didn't say, look, it's not my fault because I got changes in my brain due to the heroin. What she actually said was, well, I'm guilty. I admit it, I'm entirely guilty. But the only thing I can say is that since the offence 2 years ago, something's changed in me. And because of my new faith in Jesus Christ, I've become a new person. And I don't know if it's right or wrong, but she was absolved. I think she was found guilty, but was given no penalty. And that night, at a prayer meeting, we drank champagne. So, and she's still vulnerable, but she's in need of support. So, I mean, in a way, I'm avoiding the question, because of course there are questions about what judgment should be made in a court, and I don't know. But I do think it's true that much of the emphasis of Christianity is not on judgment, but it's on restoration and forgiveness. And that's why Jesus wasn't called judge, he was called Saviour. That's his name. Now, there are other questions about the validity of religious experience. This is all in the same field, really. We do know that for temporal lobe epilepsy, people have religious experience. The temporal lobe is the part at the side. I've talked about it before. People have epilepsy in this region. They have what they interpret as religious experiences. And there's a man called Michael Persinger who's published actually hundreds of papers. And some of these looks at the effects of magnetic transcranial stimulation of the temporal lobe. In other words, he's got a sort of magnet he puts at the side of the head, an electromagnet, and he can stimulate the temporal lobe, and he can do it actually rather gently, a weak magnetic effect, and he claims to be able to produce religious experiences, including visions of Jesus, visions of angels, out-of-body experiences. I haven't talked much about that, but you know that people who are close to death sometimes come back to consciousness and describe out-of-body experiences, going into a tunnel, meeting a creature of light, talking to angels, and all sorts of experiences. He provoked experience of abduction by aliens. Now, all this was not confirmed by a recent study from Switzerland, from Sweden, but nevertheless, in view of the fact that you get this also in temporal lobe epilepsy, this is probably at least partly correct. So the question arises, how are we going to interpret that? And in a book recently by Matthew Alper, The God Part of the Brain, focuses on the temporal lobe, and a friend of mine, Ramachandran, an Indian living in California now, also has written claiming that the temporal lobe contains the God module of the brain. Well, I think that's too simple. It's certain religious experience certainly involves more than just the temporal lobe. But even if it did just involve the temporal lobe, let's look at what Matthew Alper says. He claims that our religious, stroke spiritual, stroke sacred, stroke transcendental experiences are not manifestations of contact with God, but the way our brain interprets certain neurochemical processes. Now suppose we were to stimulate the visual part of the brain. we would get visual experiences, right? So would it be right to conclude that my visual experience of seeing you now is not a valid experience, but the way my brain interprets certain neurochemical processes? I think that would not be logical. It would be correct that it's the way my brain interprets certain neurochemical processes, but it's not just that. In my first talk, I talked about the error of nothing buttering. It's one thing that it's true that our brain is involved in our experiences, and if you mess up the brain, if you change the brain by magnetic stimulation or electrical stimulation or in other ways, you will change the experiences. But that doesn't mean that the experience is not valid, because you could give the same argument for our other experiences. Now, not everybody is on the same side, although there have been quite a lot of anti-religious people publishing on this. There have also been some on the side of the angels, shall we say, and one of these is Beauregard, who published a paper with Paquette and then a book also with O'Leary. And in his paper, he studied Carmelite nuns who lived in something of isolation, constant prayer and worship of God, and they had sometimes mystical experiences involving the feeling of the presence of God, intense joy and love, and so on. And Beauregard somehow managed to get these nuns to have the experiences in functional MRI apparatus, which is kind of remarkable because it's you're lying in a tunnel in a very technological environment, hearing quite a lot of noise, and but somehow they managed to have this experience, and he managed to show that there were changes in the activity of the brain. There's a lot of statistics that goes into this. This is not raw data, but ultimately he did manage to show that there were changes in certain parts of the brain, and it doesn't really matter what parts. And he tries to argue from this to the validity of religious experience. He just argues the opposite way from Matthew Alpin. And he published quite an interesting book, The Spiritual Brain, which he's really on the side of dualism. And it says the subtitle is The Neuroscientist's Case for the Existence of the Soul. And to my mind, that subtitle is rather naive. But I actually think the book is less naive than the subtitle. But nevertheless, my opinion is that neuroscience is neither on the side of the angels nor on the other side with respect to the validity of religious experience. I think it's neutral. And the fact that my brain is implicated in my religious experience is not a surprise. I think my brain is implicated in all my experience, including my religious experience. I wouldn't want my religious experience to be the sole basis of my faith in God. I think people who say, I had this experience and so I believe. When I was a child, I used to sing, you asked me how Jesus lives, you asked me how I know he lives within my heart. I think that's actually inadequate. We need other reasons as well, including a good intellectual involvement and discussion and so on. But at least it's not a surprise that my religious experience is involved. Now, I'd like now to come again to the question of genetic determinism, because there have been some outspoken comments about genetic determinism of religiosity. This is a copy of Time a few years ago. Probably you all know that Time is a very, very widely circulated American weekly. And on this occasion, the title of The God Gene: Does our DNA compel us to seek a higher power? Believe it or not, some scientists say yes. And before coming on to this, I should explain the background of the study that led to this study on the God gene. There had been studies of religiosity, various things to do with religiosity in twins. If you want to know if something has a genetic causation, at least partially genetic causation. One approach is to compare monozygotic twins, in other words identical twins who are genetically identical, with dizygotic twins who are not genetically identical, although there are of course some genetic similarities. And in these studies, I think all the twins were brought up normally, they were not adopted, so they had similar sorts of home environments on average, but the MZ is monozygotic, and they've got males and females. The DZ is dizygotic, so you've got males, females, or one twin male, one twin female. And in this case, they looked at the frequency of church attendance, and there was one study in Australia and one in Virginia. And so the main message is that there was, of course, a correlation between the twins. If one is a Methodist going regularly to church, the other is most likely to be a Methodist going to church as well, for environmental reasons. But there's not much difference between the monozygotic and the dizygotics. There is some difference. I think I put a blue line. Yeah. So there is a slight difference between the monozygotics and the dizygotics, but it's not very great. And so people who are wanting to look at genetic basis of something to do with religion searched for something which will be more influenced by the genes. And the thing they found was what they called self-transcendence. Now, psychologists love to invent questionnaires and which measure something. And the self-transcendence questionnaire is actually a rather vague collection of questions on all sorts of things, but it does seem to yield interesting results. So this questionnaire involves all sorts of things. Do you feel a sense of unity with all the things around you? Do you sometimes feel a spiritual connection to other people that can't be explained in words? So it's not a question of religious practice in the formal way. It's a question about one's deep psychology, really. This self-transcendence is, the correlation is much greater in monozygotic twins than in dizygotic. So there was a reason to think there's something of a genetic component, in fact a fairly strong genetic component to this, whereas there's only a weak one for things like church attendance. And so the God Gene book, here's the book, The God Gene by Dean Hamer. This focused on this self-transcendence. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details of this, but they again studied the monoamine system. And there was a gene involved in the monoamine system. I'm not going to go into detail. There were 3 variants of this gene. And it turned out that having variant C and not variant A or B is correlated with self-transcendence. So if you got variant C, you got a higher self-transcendence. You're more likely to feel one with the universe and so on. If you order a hamburger, you're more likely to say, make me one with everything. And so Dean Hamer, now, he actually admits that the title was wrong, because the title of the book was How Faith is Hardwired into Our Genes, plural, but the title was The God Gene, singular. So that's all 2 pretty funny things. He admits the title was wrong. It was actually chosen by the publisher, because there must be many genes that affect self-transcendence, and not just one. Also, the book does not concern belief in God. It's called the God Gene, but it's not actually about believing in God. Its results explain actually less than 1% of the variance in self-transcendence. So it just explains a small part. There is a genetic, he did find an influence of this allele, but it's very, very small. His work was never accepted by a scientific journal and was never confirmed. And so Carl Zimmer, writing in the Scientific American, wrote, the book would be better titled, A Gene That Accounts for Less than 1% of the variance, found in scores on psychological questionnaires, designed to measure a factor called self-transcendence, which can signify anything from belonging to the Green Party to living in ESP, according to one So despite publicity, this particular study, I think, is not a problem. We don't have to say, okay, I believe in God because I've got a weird gene. But there have been other studies. which are actually better studied. And one study showed a strong relationship between spirituality, another questionnaire, and the neurotransmitter serotonin. And I'm not going to go into the details because of time. There are several different receptors for serotonin, so it binds to several different proteins before affecting the next neuron. And they've got a radioactive substance that binds receptors of a particular type, a type called 5-HT is another word for serotonin. So the 1A serotonin receptor. They combine to that particularly. And they found an inverse correlation between the number of molecules bound and the spiritual acceptance score in a questionnaire, which asks questions like, have you ever felt in contact with a divine spiritual presence? Have your spiritual experiences helped you to understand the meaning of your life? So again, it's not about formal religion, going to church, being a Methodist and so on, but it is to do with something that we would call more to do with spirituality. And there are the measures. You see there are correlations, and they look in various different parts of the brain. So you can look at this in the living brain. I won't go into the techniques because of time, but you can look at this in the living brain, and you find this binding in various parts of the brain correlates with the self-transcendence score. So there seems to be something to do, some relation between this physical thing in the brain and the self-transcendence score, which is not really surprising because 5-HT is involved in, 5-HT or serotonin is involved in emotions, and as I mentioned, you modify it as a treatment for depression. We all know that people who are depressed have changes in their spirituality, so it's not really a surprise. But also, actually, we don't know if these changes are caused genetically. There might be, but we just don't actually know. So I mention this because this is probably the best study relating the monoamine system to spirituality, but we don't know if it's caused genetically. It could be that other factors are responsible. So for all this, is this for or against faith or religiosity of some kind? One might argue that the people who felt the presence of God did so because they had too much serotonin binding, and that this was therefore an illusion. But you might argue exactly the opposite. The people who did not feel the presence of God had too little serotonin binding, and that they were thus deprived of an important aspect of reality. I mean, supposing people, if you should blind people can't see colours, is that an argument that vision is an illusion? You know, you can argue it either way. So I think again, science is neutral on this question. So my conclusion is that on brain and religion, that some religious experiences may be provoked by brain dysfunction, but this does not invalidate religious experience as a whole, because brain dysfunction affects all sorts of things, and we don't say that this invalidates the normal function of the brain normally. And then genetic determination of religiosity seems to be only moderate, and the claim that religious believers are helpless puppets programmed by their genes is certainly unwarranted. So there.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'm going to take Chairman's prerogative and kick off, I think, with the first little question or comment. And that is one thing you have mentioned about the criminality. I mean, there are known sets of hundreds of genes that actually define 90% of the prison population of the world, which we haven't mentioned, the Y chromosome. And is that an interesting example of how you can almost guarantee that it will set you on the pathway to criminality? Is that a good example?
Well, I mentioned my wife, and I have two daughters who are medical students, and they would strongly agree on this point.
Right, yeah. Because I think that is an interesting example of how we as societies actually treat known genetic susceptibility genes and its impacts on the prison population. We still send people to prison even though they have a Y chromosome. Exactly. Is that unfair? I mean,
yes.
Leave a quality on that.
Good, yeah, okay, so we'll go here first. Yes, I'm the other member.
I was wondering, could you comment on the recent studies that seem to show that certain meditative or prayer practices involve increase or growth of certain areas of the brain.
I've read quite a lot of studies showing activation of certain parts of the brain in meditation, in prayer, and so on. Now, we do know that activated parts of the brain tend to develop. And what this means, I mean, but small effects, like the London taxi drivers, this is very famous, who have the posterior part of the hippocampus more developed than other people. We don't really know how that occurs. The hippocampus is a special part of the brain in which new neurons are being produced throughout life. In other places of the brain, like pianists, you find that certain motor parts of the brain for the hands are more developed in, I think it's pianists and also violinists. And there it may not be due to the production of new neurons, it could be due to the organization of connections. So it may not be that the, actually it may not be that that part of the brain has grown, but simply that part, the touch part for the fingers has taken over more of the brain. So there can, according to the part of the brain, be these two mechanisms for taking over more of the part of the brain. And so it's not absurd that meditation or prayer, if it's carried out a great deal, would cause changes in the brain that might be measured. But I don't know how robust this is yet. But you may know more about this.
So I just come across internet basically mention of several studies that seem to say that there seems to be some connection between an increase of gray matter and long-term meditative practice.
Increase of gray matter in the whole brain?
I
Or just a
don't
small
know enough
part?
about it to.
Okay, so anyway, that's my answer. I don't know the studies, so I can't say, but at least it's not absurd that there could be changes in the brain. But I mean, changes in the whole brain, I would need to see the studies more. There I would start to wonder if there were hormonal effects. You know, of course, if your stress actually damages the brain. So if you're living a life in which there's less stress, I can imagine that that would cause small, over a long period, small changes in the size of the whole brain. That's possible, but I don't actually have the facts.
You'll need to, yes, and then we'll get.
What happened to people that have dementia? So you will see that all of a sudden they acquire some skills or learned in their life. How does that happen?
Well, in dementia, there are, unfortunately, there are changes in the brain that are negative. The first thing that happens is probably, of course there are various kinds of dementia, but in most dementias, including Alzheimer's disease, which is the most common, probably the first changes, although the hardest to study, are changes in the synapses, these connections between the neurons. And then the changes that we start to be able to see are when in Alzheimer's disease there are called plaques and tangles. And these are physical things you can see in the brain, which are related to the death of neurons, and so there are physical changes, which I won't go into in detail. So neurons die, and at least in Alzheimer's disease, the first part of the brain to be affected is usually the hippocampus, which stores, is the initial storage site for what's called episodic memory, when we remember events. And so people lose the ability to remember new events, but there are many other changes in Alzheimer's disease. So it's kind of expected that if you damage the brain, even if it's a subtle damage occurring in many places, unfortunately the brain works less well. And so we gradually can lose skills. Those skills we've had a long time, we lose less than others. And already, even though I don't think I have Alzheimer's disease at the age of 60, I will certainly have some degeneration of my hippocampus. That happens to everybody. Starts around the age of 40. And and so by my age, there's a decrease in the ability to remember events, but fortunately other kinds of memory are still okay, like what's called syntactic memory, and semantic memory, and various kinds of motor memory, and so on. They're okay. They can even be better at my age in some people. So there are these changes, and that's part of life.
But what about savants that acquire great skills?
What about
Savants.
Oh no, you're talking about people who have sometimes called autistic savants.
Yeah.
Now that's a different question. That's not degeneration.
Opposite direction.
Now, they're sometimes called autistic savants, and that whether that's really related to the more usual kind of autism is unclear. But you do get people, for example, who are fantastically good at some obscure task, like calculating. You know, if I asked you, well, in the year 2087, what day of the week will be the 13th of February? And you think a bit, and you say it's a Thursday. Now, most people can't do that. and there is some evidence, I don't know it very well, I don't know if John knows better than me, but there is some evidence that there can be expansion of certain parts of the brain at the cost of other parts of the brain. That could be somehow involved, but I think it's not all that clear.
Right, question then, we'll deal with it. Yes.
Yeah, I want to draw you on something that wasn't central to your thesis, but you mentioned it in passing about Robert Heath. You said that he claimed that he could cure homosexuality. Now I want to, because it's current in the Anglican world, I want to kind of explore that. There is currently a controversial psychiatrist in Belfast who claims that he can cure homosexuality. Now the Royal College of Psychiatrists refutes that and says that homosexuality is a normal kind of state of being, in the sense that you're born gay or straight or whatever. What did Robert Heath come up with an answer to that, or what's your professional view on that?
I don't know exactly the thought of Robert Heath on this.
Okay.
But in his approach, there's so many things that are controversial that I think we could almost all agree that we disagree with Robert Heath.
Yeah.
And there's a question whether homosexuality should be considered a disease, and I think most homosexuals would not want to use the word disease. Many would say it's a normal tendency, it's less usual, but it's a normal tendency. Others would want to say it's an undesirable tendency that they want to change, but they would still probably not want to use the word disease. And then there's the problem that, in any case, sticking electrodes in the brain of people when you have not the faintest idea that you're going to do them any good at all is not really ethical. So I think we can all disagree with Robert Heath. But the question you're raising is, what are the causes of homosexuality? Now, it's highly debated, and because the data is not very clear, there may be a small genetic component, but there's certainly not a strong genetic component, which is hardly surprising, because you're not likely to inherit, it's likely not to run in families, because homosexuals don't often have children, although they may. And I'm not an expert on this, but one thing that has been noticed is that the thing that correlates most with being a homosexual is having at least 4 older brothers. So at least for men, and I don't know about women, but for men, if you've got 4 older homosexual brothers, sorry, not homosexual, if you've got 4 older brothers, that raises considerably the chance of being a homosexual. Of course, the Freudians have interpretations of that, and other people have interpretations, and we don't understand it. But it's probably not a very strong genetic component. The environmental component is probably more important than the genetic one, which doesn't necessarily answer the ethical question. And I'm afraid I'm going to stop there. And the Bible does say some things about homosexuality.
Yeah, well, that's a different issue.
But then we get into a whole debate.
National opinion, I'm not asking
And
spiritual opinion, I'm asking.
yeah, okay. So I'm afraid that's as far as I can go on that.
Especially against me, yes.
Oh, hi. Fantastic talk, thanks. I have a question about violence again. I mean, I'm thinking of, well, the question is not people's capacity for violence or immorality due to contextual intersubjective factors, as demonstrated in famous experiments like the Stanford prison experiment in 1969, where ordinary college kids became, within 4 days of the experiment, so violent towards their so-called prisoners that the experiment had to be abandoned. So this raises a wider point about the sort of the morality we inhabit not being just a product of our own sort of conscience or brain activity or whatever, but being a sort of consensual, something that arises from the interaction of the group, and then that raises yet wider questions about consciousness itself being a phenomena of the space in between people, the intersubjective networks, like for instance the consciousness that's happening in this room at the moment is very different to the consciousness that would be happening in another room if we were all in different places. And so can you even talk about consciousness in terms of individual brains?
Okay, well, I agree with most of what you're saying, but nevertheless, if I'm walking alone in the countryside, I think I'm still conscious. So but nevertheless, coarse interaction with other people is very important. Then another question you raised, I focused on the importance of the brain, of genes and so on, because I thought that was my subject. But clearly, now what you talk about interpersonal things and so on, that I put just in the general label of environment, which of course is very vast. And just in case some people don't know it, you're talking about the experiments where you recruit some undergraduates, nice, well-educated, middle-class undergraduates who wouldn't hurt anyone and got very high ethical morals. And then you say, well, look, it's very important to understand responses to pain. So could you just please push this button when we tell you to push the button? And I don't know all the details, but they think they're causing pain to someone. And then you but you don't actually cause pain because it's actors behind the panel. But they think that when the experimenter tells them, give them a bit more current and so on, they give more and more electric shocks and they think they're causing excruciating pain. But because the experimenter, in an authoritarian kind of way, in a particular setting, says, okay, could you do it please, then they do it. So clearly there our context can have enormous influences on us, and we're all probably vulnerable. And this is important for what you're saying, even though it wasn't really the subject of my talk. Yeah, but I agree with you.
Question in the back, yes.
This is a question about consciousness and unconsciousness. Is it fair to say that the frontal lobe is more the conscious part of your brain, but you hear of meditators who perhaps are then able to gain awareness and control over other parts of their brain to the extent of being able to slow their heart rate and these things? Is that possible, or does that make sense?
I don't think it's right to say that the frontal lobe is the conscious part of the brain. We do think that the most important parts of the brain for consciousness are the thalamus, in other words, the part that communicates with the cerebral cortex, and the cerebral cortex as a whole. But not just the frontal lobe. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I'd agree with that.
Yeah.
You can have very large lesions or surgical lesions to the frontal lobe, and the person, they have poor behaviour because of inhibition systems and so on, but they are, to all respect to purposes, conscious. They may not be very self-reflective.
Yes.
But they have qualia and so on. Yeah.
So you have changed the consciousness, but you haven't eliminated it.
Yes.
I think the inclination to fate actually has been recognized as a gift a long time ago, which is being given to different person in a different amount. So
The ability to what?
the inclination to faith or to Christian belief.
To faith. Okay.
Faith, yes. So quite long time ago, before the genetics was known, so it was actually clear that it is given to different people in a different amount. So if you can comment it, or I don't know if it was recognized as a hereditary somehow.
Well, I mean, I think in classical theology, the emphasis would be on the Holy Spirit. That faith comes from the Holy Spirit. Now, and I firmly believe that, but that doesn't mean that it's the only influence. So I'm willing to believe that there could be a small genetic influence, and I mean, one's environment. I became a Christian at the age of 11 because at the age of 10 I heard someone talking about knowing Jesus Christ as personal friend and saviour, and I just knew this was not true for me, and so I started praying, and every day I prayed, every evening, and 9 months later, a good period of time, faith was born. So, I mean, my having faith depended on people and my situation, but nevertheless I would say that the Holy Spirit was in there too. So that's a vague answer.
Yes, come over there. Do you have a question? Yes.
You made one or two references to stimulating parts of the brain, and in one instance you talked about people having quite detailed pictures and responses, and yet it seems to me that that stimulation must in itself be something relatively crude.
Yes.
In terms of molecular level or whatever scale. And I just wondered what that told us about the way the brain works, that such detailed responses could come, and if there was a very slight change in the stimulus, did that make a very big change in responses?
Now, the interesting thing is that it's coherent, right? You're just zapping with an electrode, and you would expect that would produce, at least I would expect, that would produce all sorts of incoherent things, like flashes and noises and so on. But no, it produces something much more coherent. And I think that's, you know, I haven't the faintest idea, but I think that's because the brain naturally imposes pattern, it interprets things. So if you push on one eye, you maybe close both eyes and push on one eye, then you will ultimately make it blind even for a few seconds, even if you open. But you won't see nothing, you'll see patterns, all sorts of weird patterns. So the brain, getting sort of vague, random input, imposes patterns. It seeks to interpret. And so that's my interpretation, that you zap the brain and produce something that's not really meaningful, and the brain somehow seeks out what it can do to impose meaning on it. But that's just guesswork, and we don't really know. These cases I mentioned were epileptics, and the question arises whether that happens in normal people, well, in non-epileptics, because we don't often have cases to stimulate the brains of non-epileptics. You can stimulate at the surface with a magnetic stimulation, and there, as I mentioned, you can also produce coherent phenomena like seeing angels and so on in normal people. And that's the thing that I would want to say to Ramachandran or others who speak of the God module in the brain, that actually another interpretation is that you're producing a meaning, this pattern of electrical activity by stimulation. And because the brain seeks to interpret that, then depending on who you are, you may see different things. So if you're a person who's into angels, then you may see angels. And it doesn't actually mean that you've stimulated the angel module of the brain.
There are people who see chocolate cake. That's my Okay, yes, question here, yes.
Following on from that, there are people who report out-of-body, non-out-of-body abduction by aliens when they've been outside or they've been in a particular locality. Has anybody studied the localities to see if there was evidence at the site of changed magnetic fields?
Now, Persinger, who I mentioned, had all sorts of claims about this. He claimed that many religious experiences are due to environmental magnetic fields. And I think most people don't accept this, because you can find places with magnetic fields, but they're small. And if you do a large study, some of the people are in places where there seems to be greater magnetic fields, but others aren't, and there isn't a very good correlation. So I think it's still controversial, but yeah, it's certainly controversial. I think there are people who favour what you just mentioned, that there may be local magnetic fields that could produce strange phenomena.
Of course, there's a huge number of studies on electromagnetic fields from mobile phones and what they can cause and so on. So you could have a real interesting discussion there. But, yeah, goodness me, yes. So let's come over here, yes.
I'm sorry, it's
yes.
quite connected to this religion part of brains. I was thinking, did they try to stimulate the brains in atheistic, in an atheistic person who never experienced nothing religious or something?
I don't know. But the fact is that Persinger has published. Actually, someone asked me to send them one of Persinger's most important papers. So I looked up his papers, and he's got about 300, and I didn't go through them all. And so I don't know. But one thing that strikes me is that they got positive results. Persinger got positive results in the United States, and a Swedish group got negative results with the stimulation. And I think Sweden is much less religious than the United States. So maybe there is something like that, but I don't think there's anything clear on it.
Because I was thinking, we can have memories or our imagination of things we cannot see, and if you just put electrodes, then you can imagine what is your perception of God or Jesus, because Muslims probably don't see Jesus, they don't see Jesus, probably.
Yeah.
And the other question is there any evidence about brain tumors? I heard a lot about they cause some problems in aggression or in sexuality or something, but is there any evidence of two people who have just a very similar tumor in the same place, but their attitude was different? For example, one is a criminal person, but the other also have the same desires, but he's able to maintain his feelings, and he's able to control himself.
This is difficult to study because you never get exactly the same lesion. But I think the answer, and I'd like your opinion as a second one, but I think the answer is that if you get similar lesions, there's a fair chance that you may get the same effect, but you won't always get it. And that may be because it's difficult because you never get exactly the same lesion. So it's hard to be really clear on that. Would you agree on that?
Yes. Lesions in the frontal lobe, even if they may be in the same place, will produce incredible differences in changes in the behaviour of different people. Yeah. So it may not just be that they're impinging on a slightly different neural system. It may be that the neural systems are more widespread and are more subtly interactive. So it's very complicated.
Exactly. So that's the message, it's very complicated. But the fact is that the localization of different regions in the brain is a rather crude thing. The thing that's been studied very well is language. And it's in undergraduate textbooks, it's very clear that there's Broca's area near the front on the left side, which is involved in the production of language. There's Wernicke's area further back in the production, in the interpretation of language. But if you really go into the details, it seems to be more complicated than that, and there are differences between people, and we don't fully understand it.
Or my question was probably in sort or in direction that two people have the same desire or the same violence potential because of some disease, although I know it's very hard to have just the same desire, but they differently, they don't do the same thing, do you know, Like
well, yes.
Yeah.
It's clear that there's not a brain region for hitting someone on the head. There's a brain region that may control levels of anger, and then the effect on behavior will depend on many things. It may make you hit someone on the head. It may make you go and write a scientific paper.
Yeah.
It's quite complicated.
Peter, yes.
I think there's a great caution in the use of the word the brain region 4. It's a bit like the gene 4.
Yeah.
And we can really massively overinterpret these PET scans. The resolution of a PET scan is really fuzzy relative to the resolution of a neuron. And you've got an area in which activity is occurring, but in which loads of other activity is occurring. So the things are superimposed activity-wise within a spot isn't a surprise. That it lights up on a PET scan makes it look like you found a little Lego cube where something's happening. If we remove that Lego cube, we'd take it out and we could swap it with another one. But it's a much more interconnected thing that the PET scans do a really fuzzy job of showing. They give indication, but they're not strong.
Yeah. Yes, question.
Yeah,
well, first in front of you.
Oh,
First,
sorry,
and then we'll go back. Sorry, yes. But in order, yeah.
Just a short question.
Yes.
Suppose we find a neural area whose intensity of activation, is highly correlated or even anticipates our propensity to act in a purportedly self-determined way.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what that finding may or could implicate concerning our conception of free will?
Okay. Now, that has been studied in a simplistic situation. For example, pushing a button. Okay? We do know that before a motor act, we get activity in the motor cortex, and before that, there's activity in a region called the supplementary motor area, which is a bit more on the midline. It's roughly the same area, but just a bit more medial. And actually, if you imagine the motor activity without doing it, then you get the activity in the supplementary motor area, but not in the motor cortex. So we can begin to piece together, in some situations, at least the side that's getting close to the motor activity. People can also study the electrical activity coming from these regions. And they try to, no, I'm not going to go into too many details. But the trouble is you got me onto something that could take half an hour. But I'm not going to go further on the neurology of this. But so the question of free will. If, like me, you're a compatibilist, that's okay. If I choose tea rather than coffee, it's because I like tea. And it all comes from my brain. So it's all stocked in the brain. And so that's just, I choose tea. And if you're a libertarian, then maybe you're going to have a problem. You're wanting to have a place where the soul comes in. And it's not all determined by the brain. So I think, although there's a lot we could ask about the neuroscience and the neurology, and if I had half an hour we could go into this, I think the basic questions there are not neuroscience but philosophy.